honor to be here. Does it sound good right now? So first, I just want to make sure I say my thank yous, Juan Manuel, Paul, Sebastian, Matt, everyone else at Aspetar, and for the opportunity and invite to be here. This is one of the greatest opportunities I've had in my professional career, so thank you to everyone. Very, very grateful. I've been here since last Sunday, interacting with the staff that's going to provide medical services for the IAAF World Championships here in September, and then many of those medical staff will also be assisting with medical care at the World Cup in 2022. So truly an honor to interact with everyone and to help out. So my goal here today, following those two outstanding talks, is to focus more on when things go sideways, when someone gets too hot and they suffer an exertional heat stroke. My goal is to kind of quickly review some of the best practices related to exertional heat stroke. When we did this for the medical staff on Wednesday, the session was 3 hours long, to give you an idea of the amount of time we would need to do this properly, explaining the rationale and the background and the techniques. But obviously, we're going to do a glimpse today. These are just my disclosures, which I always provide in any scientific presentation. Those are the 9 corporate partners for the institute that I run at the University of Connecticut and other sources of funding that we receive. So exertional heat stroke is one of the 3 leading causes of death in military training, especially in America during basic training. We had the not so wise move of putting almost all of the military bases that have basic training in America, we put them in the southeast portion of our country. It's the hottest and most humid. We have a very huge problem with heat stroke during basic training. Laborers during work in the heat, whether they be construction workers, oil field people who work on fiction train tracks, anybody who has to do physical activity outside in the heat, that's by far the largest population with a problem worldwide. High school and college sports in America is a constant problem related to exertional heat stroke because, again, we often are not very smart in America, and I can criticize my own country, but we have American football, and we decide to have them do their hardest training in the hottest time of the year in August in full gear. And some of these guys, remember, are 150 kilograms doing 6 hours of activity in 40 degrees Celsius and 70% humidity, okay? So just to give you an idea, I routinely have people who are lose 13, 14 kilograms per day from sweat. So 30 pounds of sweat in a day. Because some of these people have 3.5 liter per hour sweat rate, who are these massive individuals. All right? So we're going to talk about some of these issues right now. This is just where I work at University of Connecticut. We are heat lab studies. Half of my life has to do with performance in the heat, like the stuff that was mentioned in the first 2 talks, and the other half of our life has to do with the medical side of things. So Falmouth Road Race is probably something you've never heard of, but I feel like it's important to mention related to exertional heat stroke. Falmouth Road Race takes place in the state of Massachusetts in the United States every summer on the 3rd Sunday of August. Right here is the medical director on the left side, Dr. Jardine, and the medical coordinator, Chris Trianos. He's also the medical coordinator of the Boston Marathon. I worked with him for 14 years at Boston. And Dr. Jardine has been the medical director at Falmouth for 20 years. I've worked at Falmouth for 25 years. And why it's important is this race has more exertional heat strokes than any race in America. Okay, we average 20 exertional heat strokes per year at this race. 3 years ago, we had 48 exertional heat strokes, 55 heat exhaustions in a 12K race. So my job is triage, and I triaged 103 people in the span of about 80 minutes, okay? So this is, we usually have about 30 guests come in from around the world each year to just observe medical care so that they can be prepared at different events that they're at. Because a lot of medical professionals, the next exertional heat stroke that they treat is often the first exertional heat stroke they'll treat in their career, because they're just not extremely common in most medical settings. So here you come, and in just 2 hours of work, you get to have at least 20 heat strokes to be involved with. So it's a good use of people's time. The good news is that every single person who's entered the medical tent in the 44 years of the race, over 400 runners who've had exertional heat stroke, everyone has survived. No one has spent more than 1 night in a hospital, okay? And only about 7% of the people spend 1 night in a hospital. And when I say exertional heat stroke at this race, it has to reach a very high threshold to be exertional heat stroke. It's over 40.5 with CNS dysfunction. There are some people that are more mild ones we put as heat exhaustion, and some people would consider them heat stroke. All right, this book we published last year. This gives a much more in-depth of all the different factors we provide when you're thinking about medical care at road race events, and especially related to track and field and medical care, the passion of a lot of the people in the room here today. Obviously, when people enter a medical tent in an endurance event where the risk of heat stroke obviously is highest, like 10K race, marathon, race walks, things like that. Hyperthermia, cardiac events, and heat stroke are your three biggest things that you're going to be concerned about that could cause your runner to die while you're providing medical care for them. So these are the things people want to focus on, but my focus today will be heat stroke. As Sebastian had mentioned earlier, and has been noted by others already here at this conference, there's a lot of hot weather events that are upcoming. Obviously, the Tokyo Olympics, as was noted before, actually, I just have publications later. We actually just published a paper this past year that looked at every single Olympic Games in history from 1896 to 2020, and we looked at the projected temperatures for those days that they're having the Tokyo Olympics. And if it's just the average temperatures in Tokyo, it will be the hottest Summer Olympics in history. And think about Atlanta, Athens, LA. There's been a lot of really hot Olympics. Remember when Tokyo hosted it back in 1960, they moved it to an October Olympics because of the heat. This particular Olympics is staying in the August time frame. As you guys well aware, you have the World Championships here for track and field. Some great efforts have been made to protect the athletes, one related to medical care, but two, they moved the time of the marathon. It's starting at midnight to try to be the friendliest in terms of health and safety. The Women's World Cup in France can be quite hot. You guys may remember that back in 2003, 12,000 people died from heat stroke in France in the span of 10 days during a horrible heat wave, classic heat wave. And the Men's World Cup is going to be here in 2022. For us, personally, a big issue for me back in America is climate change. High school football and runners are the two biggest constituents that have heat stroke in my country who are athletes, and climate change is making it worse literally every year. So it's something to consider. I'm just going to give you a little background on two case studies as we head into some key aspects of the care for heat stroke. And they have both given permission to cover their stories. And in fact, there's a recent issue of the journal Sports Medicine. We have a paper called Exertional Heat Stroke, State or Trait. And we review both of these cases of exertional heat stroke and give a lot of details related to their medical care. Gavin Class is here. He is a football player at Towson State University in Maryland. He suffered an exertional heat stroke at a football practice. And the athletic trainer, who's the licensed medical professional in America who is first on scene to provide medical care, knew it was an exertional heat stroke right away and had him in a cold water immersion tub that they had already set up at the sideline within 3 minutes of collapse. But then the ambulance arrived soon after, and they took him out of the tub after only being in the tub for 3 minutes, and then sent him to the hospital. He ended up having a 2-year recovery, 18 surgeries, and a liver transplant. His temperature at the hospital 90 minutes later was still over 41.5. Okay? So the key thing that I want to mention here today to keep this really, really simple amongst all the things you're learning here at this conference is the key to treating exertional heat stroke is 4 steps, just 4 steps. Recognizing it quickly, okay? Second is getting an accurate core body temperature. Third is using the best cooling modality you have available to you, preferably cold water immersion, if you have the ability to be prepared for an exertional heat stroke. And fourth is cool first, transport second. You always finish the cooling for exertional heat stroke on site with appropriate medical care there before you ever send them to the hospital, because you have a limited number of minutes if someone's going to survive an exertional heat stroke. A fascinating thing we've been able to do at the Corey Stringer Institute is we've tracked over 2,400 heat strokes that have happened in America in military and athletic settings. And if a person's temperature gets under 40 degrees C within 30 minutes of collapse, all 2,400 people have survived. Okay? So basically, your policies and procedures and your emergency action plan have to all be geared towards getting your person's temperature under 40 degrees C within 30 minutes of collapse. And those are the 4 steps that make that happen. Recognizing it quickly. When you're running out to an athlete, for instance, like on an American football field where we have a lot of heat strokes, you know if they have asthma, sickle cell trait, diabetes, anaphylaxis, you know some things that would cause somebody to maybe be down on the field. And if they don't have those conditions and the cardiac everything's fine, and someone's collapsed during intense exercise in the heat, you're immediately considering the possibility that's an exertional heat stroke. And then if you think of that quickly, you're going to be getting an accurate core body temperature measure. So I'll talk about those things. But so for Gavin Class, they did the first and the third of the 4 steps that I mentioned to you. They recognized it quickly. They used cold water immersion, but for only 3 minutes. But they didn't do number 2. They didn't get a core body temperature. And 4, they didn't do cool first, transport second. And then that led to a 2-year recovery and a liver transplant. Okay? So obviously he survived, very, very lucky to survive. Almost no one would survive that similar circumstances. But he's now a big advocate, obviously, for proper heat stroke care. Gavin Class is right here. He's University of Miami. His story is much, much faster to tell. They did 0 of the 4 that I just mentioned. And he had a 2-year recovery, and he had 12 surgeries, okay, to barely survive an exertional heat stroke case. So here's 2 people who ended up surviving who help us tell the story and are comfortable enough sharing all of their medical information so that we can try to educate others. So when we look at death that happens in sport, and I mentioned to you before that's always one of the 3 leading causes of death. This is in American football. These are the leading causes of death: cardiac, head injury, heat stroke, and sickle cell trait or exertional sickling. So I'm just giving you an idea. And in basic training, it's always in the top 2 for us in America. So this is the paper I mentioned to you earlier. We looked at every single World Cup, every single Olympics, and looked at the environmental conditions that the athletes would face in the upcoming 2020 Olympics and 2022 World Cup. So this is just as a reference I thought you might find interesting. This is the most important paper I want to mention today that I think all of you should consider getting access to. This just came out last year, and it's kind of the new gold standard for pre-hospital care of exertional heat stroke. The world of sports medicine, meaning athletic trainers, team physicians, physios, they understand much better the world of exertional heat stroke. But the EMTs, EMS services, ambulance, and emergency room physicians don't have as much experience with exertional heat stroke, and there's often a disconnect between those 2 fields. So as I just mentioned, in America, the athletic trainer and the physician want to continue cooling, and the ambulance provider wants to take the person to the hospital. So we have to try to find a way for these 2 entities to work together. If I have time at the end, I'm going to give you one example of us having to work that strategy out. This is just another example of a good paper that came out recently for people who provide medical care at road race medical tents. We actually looked at the environmental conditions and predicted out for you how many exertional heat strokes and heat exhaustions you would have based on your race length and the environmental conditions. So you could make a prediction of how much medical supplies, equipment, and staff you would need. This was from the military working group from a couple years ago, where we tried to help them develop strategies for algorithms for preventing sudden death in military situations. A good example here, this is Lackland Air Force Base in America, San Antonio, where they were facing large minutes before they could get to their exertional heat stroke care, sometimes 45 minutes to get someone to cold water immersion. They overhauled their policies at their facility, and they built cold water immersion stations around the base so that it was never more than 7 or 8 minute drive now to have cold water immersion. So that was like something to obviously enhance care for these soldiers. In America this past year, we faced a really big story that got a lot of attention. His name is Jordan McNair. He was an American football player at the University of Maryland, had a heat stroke in May of 18, passed away in June from the complications. And this report you could find online. It's a 120-page report of all the things they did wrong providing care for Jordan McNair. So this is used in a lot of medical school curriculums, athletic training curriculums back stateside for us, because it goes through all of the basics rather related to exertional heat stroke care. So when we're talking about defining heat stroke, usually the definition, it's severe hyperthermia at the time of collapse, looking at some kind of CNS dysfunction. But when you're with someone right away, you might have some kind of a lucid interval where they might not be extremely hyperthermic at the time of, they are extremely hyperthermic, but they might have this lucid interval where they're not like unconscious or in a coma at the time of collapse, all right? This is a good kind of take-home for the ability to handle extreme hyperthermia and how it affects mortality. Here is the number of minutes over 41 degrees Celsius, and this is the percent surviving. This is passive heat stroke in the pinkish color, and the bluish or purplish color is exertional heat stroke. As you can probably imagine, this is not a human model study because you can't get people to volunteer to be in the group that's not going to get cooling for over an hour, or you'd have to pay a lot of money. But this is an animal model, but it gives you just an idea of obviously the strong trend for precipitous drop in survival rate as the number of minutes of hyperthermia increases. Thankfully, in humans, that 30-minute window has given us 100% survival with exertional heat stroke. So humans seem to have a little more robust ability to tolerate extreme hyperthermia than the rats that they used in this model. So when we talk about cool first, transport second, we do this because in typical medical care situations, it's going to take you some time to do the assessment, a time for an ambulance to arrive, a time that they're on site, a time that it takes them to get back to the hospital. And then there's basically very few hospitals in the world that have cold water immersion tubs ready to treat an exertional heat stroke, right? So it's going to take time to set up all of the care. So keep thinking of all of those minutes that you're adding on. This is just an example of, I've been an expert witness on 44 cases of exertional heat stroke in America that athletes have died from exertional heat stroke. And I've assisted the family during some of the legal pursuits. And this is just an average of some of those cases, 45 minutes for them to start the cooling process. So they're at 42 Celsius, and you're starting the cooling now. So they're usually hypothermic for somewhere in the hour and a half range. And that's why they pass away, and hence that's why there's a lawsuit. All right? So heat stroke needs to be treated prior to arrival at the hospital. These are the basic things that I already mentioned to you for the steps, but I have it. I'm not going to show it. These 4 steps that I already mentioned to you. Rapid recognition, rapid assessment, rapid cooling, rapid advanced care. When we're talking about recognition, there's a lot of things you could talk about here. The most important thing is considering the possibility of heat stroke during intense exercise in the heat so that you're not losing minutes. A lot of times people don't realize it's an exertional heat stroke, and we lose a lot of minutes on the front end not cooling someone. We also have to make sure that we dispel myths. There's still textbooks that say you're going to have dry skin with exertional heat stroke. I personally have treated 295 exertional heat strokes in my career, and 0 of them have had dry skin. Okay? That comes from the classic heat stroke medical world, where there's a failure of the thermoregulatory system and the person is not sweating anymore, versus an overwhelming of the thermoregulatory system that you see in exertional heat stroke. And then we see people, this is just an example, I could put 50 myths up here, but don't cool him too quickly, is often what people will say or be worried about exertional heat stroke care. It's in fact the exact opposite with exertional heat stroke, is cool them as fast as humanly possible because you have a very limited number of minutes with them being hyperthermic. When we're talking about rapid assessment, we got to do an accurate body temperature, right? And if we're going to use an accurate body temperature for a lot of different reasons. One is there's a lot of conditions that could look very similar. So picture somebody coming into your medical tent at a marathon or a half marathon or a sprint triathlon, and they have CNS dysfunction and they collapse soon after the finish line. How do you know if it's a hyponatremia case? How do you know if it's a heat stroke? How do you know if they just didn't fall their head because they fell from postural hypertension and hit a curb and they have a head injury and that's why they're unconscious? You have no idea until you've done an ISTAT to get their blood sodium reading and you've done a rectal temperature to get their core body temperature. And these are very, very simple techniques to do, and it helps you figure it out very quickly. But if we're doing body temperature assessment, we obviously need something that's valid, and we need something that's logistically feasible. These ones, for instance, I use esophageal in the lab, but they're just very much not feasible when someone's unconscious or having a seizure or being combative. Another thing I won't have time to get into is 10 to 15% of all heat stroke people are very combative when you're cooling. So they're punching, kicking, fighting, and extremely difficult to deal with. We'll have 8 adult humans taking care of 1 person because they're combative. But you obviously have to overcome them because they're going to die from the hyperthermia and they're not acting properly at that time. The only one we have at this time is the rectal temperature. I know you could use gastrointestinals like an ingestible thermistor, but for someone who has an acute heat stroke, you can't run up and give them a pill to swallow at that time. So unless every single person in the race had an ingestible thermistor in, you need a way to get accurate temperature. Very, very importantly, if there's one of the few messages you get from me here today, never ever use these when people have been doing intense exercise in the heat. I've published over 10 studies, meta-analysis, systematic review, and original research studies looking at the validity of these devices during intense exercise in the heat, and they are grossly inaccurate. If you don't have a rectal thermometer at the time of a potential heat stroke, I'd much rather you use your clinical judgment to figure out if it's heat stroke and cool if predicated. But don't ever use these devices to make the assumption of heat stroke. We're talking about rapid cooling. I mentioned to you earlier, the color is distorted here, but it doesn't lose the message. This paper was published back in 2007. This is an example of a few common cooling modalities. So I don't know if you prefer Celsius or Fahrenheit, but this is about 108 down to 104. This is cold water immersion here. Someone cools at about 1 degree Fahrenheit every 3 minutes or 1 degree Celsius every 5 minutes. When they're in cold water immersion, that the water is cold enough and the water is circulated aggressively. This is rotating cold wet towels, or kind of like burrito or taco method, wrapping somebody up in a tarp with freezing cold water and ice, or having towels all over their exposed skin. Covering as much of the skin surface area is obviously the key to cooling someone, similar to using cooling as mentioned before for performance advantages. It has advantages obviously here just to cool somebody down. This is ice bags on the peripheral artery. So I'm really old and I was in college in the 1980s. This is what I learned when I was in school to cool a hot athlete. Ice bags on peripheral arteries. So it's really just a waste of a bag, ice, and time, because here you're looking at 100 minutes to get that, and we're well beyond the range of that. Very, very unlikely someone would survive the heat stroke. All right. With cold water immersion, I think I have this. This is an example. We just published this of using tarp-assisted cooling. This is used a lot in the American military and remote settings because you just need a cooler, ice, water, and a tarp. And you put somebody in ice and water and you shimmy the tarp back and forth. Actually gives about 65 to 70% as effective as cold water immersion. Military will often use this while they're transporting the person to definitive care, or use it as their only strategy if definitive care is too far away. This is an example of a lot of different cooling modalities. This is the fastest ever reported in a research study. This is Glenn Kenny out of the University of Ottawa. The coldest water, the whole body in aggressively circulated water up to 0.35 degrees Celsius per minute, which is ridiculous. It's faster than 1 degree Celsius per 3 minutes. In the other cold water immersions one here, you see more in the field setting situations. The study we just published in Medicine and Science and Sport and Exercise is the largest data set of exertional heat stroke in the medical literature with 274 heat strokes, and our average cooling rate was 0.22 degrees Celsius per minute for cold water immersion in heat stroke, all heat stroke patients. This is an example just related to body size. This is related to the study I just mentioned. This is really the classic study in the field, published in 2003, pre-released in 2002. But here you can see the rapid drop in the coldest water. The first 2 degree drop was 0.39 degrees Celsius per minute. So this is kind of the gold standard research study. This is the paper I mentioned to you earlier, published back in 2007. I'd mention it just as I don't have enough time to go in great depth, but I go through about 10 different misconceptions, and there's a checklist of things to consider when implementing cold water immersion. This is the paper I just mentioned to you related to the largest data set, published in 2015. This is 274 heat strokes from the Falmouth Road race. The outcome of that is here, 100% survival. Home discharge on 93%. That's only because we have a lot of physicians. We have 20-something physicians at the medical tent, and we're able to observe them for many hours after. And the very small emergency room at the nearby hospital could never handle 20 or 25 heat strokes. But it gives you an idea of how fast, if you can get someone's temperature down very rapidly, very likely they're going to be home for dinner with their family on the same day. And you think if it's prolonged just by 30 or 40 minutes, they might have a year or 2 year recovery. And if it's prolonged by an hour, they're going to die. So all of these things are influenced just by a few different minutes that take place. The last one is rapid advanced care. And that's obviously, we still always want the ambulance on site at the time of a heat stroke so that they can take the person when the cooling is done, if necessary. This is an example of the tub. These are Rubbermaid tubs. I don't have another picture. This is a 150-gallon tub. They have 100-gallon tubs as well, and I know gallons probably is not that useful to you, but If you're Googling Rubbermaid stock tanks, these are indestructible, very good to work with. We recommend, I know my time is up, recommend a sheet underneath the armpits here to help them, especially if they're combative. You have good control over them, prevents them from going in the water. So this is just an example of an algorithm that was in the paper that I mentioned earlier for pre-hospital care, and this is the awesome algorithm that Sebastian had came up with for the IAAF, preparing for the World Championships. And it's a really nice walkthrough to consider hyponatremia, considering cardiac issues, and if they're not present, and heat stroke is the likely outcome, moving forward with cold water immersion, cooling on site, and taking them out at around 39 degrees Celsius. That's it right now. So in summary, obviously identify at-risk events and plan ahead. I mentioned to you the paper earlier that we have a predictive ability, obviously based on the environmental conditions for the number of heat strokes we'll see. Remember to always come up with a strategy if medical staff is on site to cool first, transport second. Be prepared to cool in transport and at the hospital if you don't have medical staff on site, like if there's a youth sporting event where they don't have the ability to do cold water immersion, to still take advantage of all the minutes during transport and at the hospital. And obviously, we need to share expertise between pre-hospital care medical professionals so that we get these standards in place. All right, thank you very much.